It's always a remarkable thing for a member of the Heidelberg University to give a lecture at Prague. Many people don't know that the alma mater of Prague is also the mother of our faculty, of our university at Heidelberg. When Heidelberg University was founded in 1386, we had a lack of scholarship at Heidelberg, and we had to bid 4 magistri from Prague in order that we could found our university. Yeah, so it was in those times the German theologians were not able to study at Paris because there was a split in the church between the pave at Avignon and the other pave, and this was the chance for us, to found a new university, a split, and so when we come back from Heidelberg here to Prague, we are coming back to our roots, but many don't know it, at Prague, and also many don't know it at Heidelberg, we have a common root also in Paul, at least as Christian and theologians, and my topic is now fanaticism and religion. There's today much talk of religion, fanaticism and violence, but only few are aware, above all in a secular society, that in every service we say, peace upon you. Peace is the central message, but there's no doubt that there are people justifying today their terrorism with religious convictions. We often agree too quickly that they only abuse their religion. We know very well that there are fanatics in all religions, also in Christianity, also in Protestantism. Baptists have been persecuted in the time of Reformation. We owe Martin Luther the principle that in matters of faith one should act only by word, never by violence. Non vi sed verbo. And this formula is also part of the Lutheran church orders, also in the Confessio Augustana. You find this formula. But Luther's anti-Jewish hate writings contradict his own principle. More sympathetic are other theologians, I think, in this regard. I name Johannes Brenz, nobody knows him, but he was a reformer of Württemberg, and he rejected executions of Baptists and witches, of both. Or the Catholic Jesuit, Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld, from my homeland in the Nether Rhine, who published 1631 an anonymous book against the witch trials, his Cautio Criminalis. This book was a turnabout in order to finish these trials. That is to say, we find not only in Islam, but also in the history of all religions, also in our own Protestant tradition, both close together. Religious fanaticism and religiously motivated opposition against such fanaticism. Fanaticism has more to do with religion than we like. This is what etymology reveals. The word fanatic derives from the Latin word fanum, that is temple. It is preserved in the adjective profane, meaning anything outside the sacred temple district. We still today distinguish profane and sacred buildings. A fanatic is originally a person who was seized by a deity in the temple. But there's to be something more. The verb, the Latin verb fanari, means to raise or to rage. It means an excessive behavior. A fanatic is a madman. In the time of confessional conflicts in our history, the term fanatici was coined in order to denounce the respectively other ones. Protestants were fanatics in the eyes of the Catholics. Small deviant Protestant groups called the Schwärmer were fanatics in the eyes of the Protestant. majority, but also the representatives of the Enlightenment later on called their opponents fanatici. World history clearly states that fanaticism has something to do with religion, and it reveals also fanatics are, of course, always the other ones. But in other cases, the world history clearly points in a different direction. Take Islam. Islam is translated devotion to God. The word implies the word peace, in Hebrew, shalom. Muslims seek peace in the relationship to God, to their neighbors, and to themselves. Nevertheless, critics of religion sometimes see a potential fanatic in every religious person. Before one gets upset about it, one should admit this indicates a serious problem. It is indisputable that religious faith gives people the courage to stand up for something that they no longer want to question. Many resistance fighters against injustice and dictatorship have gained their strength through an unconditional religious belief. Therefore, the question is justified: is it the same force of the unconditioned that is effective on the one hand in terrorists and on the other hand in people who resist inhumanity? Is it the same energy? There with a negative, here with a positive target. And where do we find the switch to steer this energy in the right direction? That's why we have to study theology, to find the switch. Paul should serve us today as a case study for this problem. Our question is, was Paul a fanatic who once persecuted people just because they had a different belief? And did he become a reconciler through his conversion? Or remained he even as follower of Christ, basically the old fanatic who had only changed the direction of his fanaticism? In his letters he polemicizes harshly against his opponents, calls them servants of Satan and curses them. Must we not doubt whether his conversion to the Christian faith was really a turning away from his fanaticism? I would like to ask 4 questions concerning this problem. The first question is, was Paul a fundamentalist fanatic in the time before his conversion to the Christ followers? Or, that's the other possibility, have the traditions about him obscured the image of his past? You know, the darker the former life of a holy man was, the brighter his life shines after his conversion. Our second question is, was his conversion really an overcoming of his fanaticism? And if we affirm this, we must put immediately a third question. Has Paul hold on this departure from his fanatical fundamentalism? Or did he just change the direction of his fanaticism? And if he came to the conclusion that Paul actually changed his attitude, there would still be one last question. How can we explain his excessive polemic against his opponents? Was this a relapse into his fanaticism? Yeah? Or is he revealing his true nature there? At the end, I return to the fundamental problem of fanaticism and religion. I think the critics of religion are right when they say that religion is dangerous. But a German poet, Hölderlin, was also right when saying, wo Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. But where there is danger, also grows what rescues. Our first question. Was Paul a fundamentalist before his conversion? My thesis is that Paul was not by birth or by his family a fanatical Jewish fundamentalist, but has for a short time temporarily radicalized himself. We all know such people. In Germany we have some members of so-called radical co-groups, communist groups, yeah, in their youth, in their studies time, who later became prime ministers. at Württemberg. Now he is member of other co-groups, conservative and Catholic. Yeah? But he's a good minister. Maybe this makes some people a little bit more lenient towards people who have radicalized themselves in their youth for a while. I know many of such people, yeah, who sympathize with the RAF, yeah, with our terrorists. And the whole life they have made a good job, yeah, social, engaged, and so on. But what does it mean to radicalize oneself? What makes radicalized fundamentalists and fanatics stand out? I think there are people who over-identify themselves as the norms of their own groups. This leads, on the one hand, to aggression against outsiders, people outside of their group, but often even more, to aggression against dissenters in their own group, and in any case, to an increased readiness to use violence inside and outside. Often groups in society react with such a fundamentalism when they are in danger to become cultural losers through changes in society, such as a modernization push. I think also in our populistic movement, yeah, there's a reaction against the modernization of our society. They do not necessarily belong to the underprivileged material losers. That's a myth. They may well be established, yet they feel threatened by a development that challenges their beliefs and their lifestyle. But was there such a fundamentalism in Judaism at that time? This is not an anachronism, yeah, to speak on fundamentalism in this sense in these old times. My answer, there was indeed once a fundamentalist revolt against a modernization of the Jewish society in the 2nd century before Christ. Around 175, some Jerusalem Jews tried to modernize the Jewish religion. They identified the Jewish god Yahweh with Zeus, redesigned an altar according to international patterns. They abolished circumcision and food laws that separated Jews from pagans. And they founded, above all, a Greek polis with Greek institutions in Jerusalem. In doing so, they tried, with the help of Syrian king, to implement their reform by force against the other Jews. On the other hand, there was a rebellion in the countryside, outside of Jerusalem, led by the Maccabees. The rural population would have become second-class citizens if the reform had succeeded. Hence her resistance to the reform. The motivation for their resistance they called zeal for the law, zelos. In Greek, this zeal is called zelos, that is contained in the word zelotes, zealots. The model for this zeal was the priest Pinchas, who after Numeri 25 once killed Zimri and his wife because Zimri refused to divorce his foreign wife and her idolatry. The law did not allow intermarriage with pagan women unless they converted to Judaism, according to these people. Following the example of the zealot Pinchas, the Maccabees killed other Jews who fell away from the Jewish faith and sacrificed in a pagan manner. The fundamentalist uprising was successful. Their fundamentalism, I should say, had a tradition-preserving function at that time. We do not know if Jews would have preserved their cultural identity without this uprising. However, the victorious Maccabees quickly adapted to modern Hellenism. Only in rejection of a violent reform from above, with help of the Syrian king, did fundamentalist groups temporarily determine Jewish history. And I have a certain understanding for this rebellion. Yeah? In my youth, our pastor read with us the books of Maccabees, and of course we sympathize all with the Maccabees. But when I met some classical philologists, they refused Maccabees, yeah? They opposed Hellenism and so on. It was And that's our question, was Paul influenced by such traditions? What do we know about him? From his origin, I think it is unlikely that he grew up with the ideal of zeal or as zealot. Paul was born in Tarsus, a city in southern Asia Minor. He was educated in Jerusalem to study Jewish law there. It's often assumed that he came from a Pharisaic family, but we have no evidence for Pharisees outside of Palestine. Many think the stricter Pharisaic law or practice could be practiced only in the Holy Land itself. Above all, I think statements of Paul himself speak for the fact that he was not always a Pharisee. He reports on his development and youth in 2 times in his letters. Both texts speak of his turn about before Damascus. The one report in Philippians 3 presents this turn as a conversion, that is as a transformation of his beliefs. The other one in Galatians 1 as a vocation, that is as commissioning with the task to missionize all peoples. What these 2 accounts say about Paul's pre-Christian era is very interesting. In Philippians 3, Paul lists 3 features of his pre-Christian existence that he had already inherited, distinguishing from them 3 other features he had acquired in life. The 3 inherited traits and features are: first, is circumcision; secondly, is descent from Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin; and third, his family, in which the Hebrew culture and language was still alive. These traits were not a result of his decisions. They are followed now by 3 features that differ linguistically from the first 3 inherited traits. Paul says, I was a Pharisee according to the law. Second, a pursuer according to zeal. And perfect according to justice. These 3 features are not inherited but acquired. Wherefore, Paul emphasizes firstly that he was according to the law kata nomon a Pharisee. The formula kata nomon, according to the law, sounds for years in antiquity as the opposite to kata physin, that is by nature or by birth. In other words, if Paul was a Pharisee by law, he was not Pharisee by birth. Paul probably decided to join the group of the Pharisees first when he started his education in Jerusalem. Also, the other statements point to conscious decisions of Paul. Secondly, Paul was following the church after zeal, kata zelos. That is, he was seized by the ideal of zeal and persecuted the Christ followers because they broke the law. In doing so, he placed himself in the tradition that once had defended the Jewish religion in the Maccabean uprising. For Paul too, Phinehas must have been the great model of his zeal. Phinehas had once killed a Zimri only because he had married an alien woman. Even if Paul did not kill a Christian, even if he did not participate in the killing of Stephen, which, as the Acts says, then it must have been clear to him in those times that unlawful killing of lawbreakers was legal. That was part of his inner program. Das war zu seinem inneren Kino, gehört das. Paul adds a third feature after that. He says that he was at that time, thirdly, perfect according to righteousness, kata ten dikaizunen. This must be read in this way. Because he practiced zeal for the law, he was convinced that he perfectly fulfilled the requirements of the law. Paul read about the zealot Phinehas in Psalm 106, that his zeal, Phinehas' zeal, was credited him as righteousness, or to righteousness. He alludes with the phrase perfect according to righteousness to this honoring characterization of the zealot Phinehas. We do not bear anything here about a dissatisfaction with the law or doubts about it because he was unable to be fulfilled. The conversion before Damascus met someone who was in his consciousness proud of his law and tradition. Philippians 3 makes plausible, according to my view, the assumption that Paul was not from the beginning a Pharisee, but that he became secondarily a Pharisee and zealot. Our other question is, was this a development to Pharisaism in one act only? Or can we see an evolution here with different phases, different steps? For this, let us have a look on the second autobiographical text of Paul in Galatians. Here too, he looks back in his pre-Christian life. I'm citing, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." Galatians 1:13 following. In this passage, the Greek formulation is significant that Paul made progress beyond his contemporaries. Paul uses here a technical term, prokope, in the verb form prokopte. This is an expression in philosophy in those times of the progress that someone makes in a philosophy or in a religion. The key question is whom Paul has surpassed in his progress. Paul does not say that he has outbid all others. He only says that he outbid many peers in his people, many of the same age. Probably this refers only to the peers of his generation who have learned from Pharisaic teachers what true Judaism is. Through his zeal, Paul surpassed these other disciples of the Pharisees once more. So in Galatians 1, we have an indication that he has outdone the other Pharisees, disciples, by the ideal of zeal. That was his progress in Judaism. The pre-Christian development of Paul would have looked like this. He came from the diaspora to Jerusalem, I think from a liberal Judaism, in search of his Jewish identity. He first became a Pharisee in Jerusalem, studying the law with a Pharisee. Probably his teacher was Gamaliel, who was praised in Acts for his tolerance for Christians. But then he turned away from this tolerant attitude and joined in an elite progress, prokope, a particularly strict current, the zealots, who were intolerant and wanted to enforce the law, if necessary, by force against dissenting minorities in Judaism. Paul says indirectly that not all Jews shared his fanatical zeal. He himself emphasizes that he has outstripped all others by zeal. He was an exception in this regard. But as far as his past life is concerned, it became not darkly painted retrospectively in order to make his conversion all the brighter. Paul, I think, has temporarily radicalized as a young man, as many have done in my generation. Even in my family, I discovered, sympathies for terrorism. They confessed it first that they were grown old, after 60 years. Also, Paul himself indicates the violent character of his zealotism. He says he has tried to destroy the church violently. Acts says that he has killed Christians, or at least agreed with their killing. That must have been part of his inner program. If he admired the zealot Pinchas, killing heretics was a legitimate option. Whether he really directly was involved in killing Christians is questionable, I think. Acts makes it clear in its report of the execution of Stephen that Paul was only a witness, not an actor. Certainly, Paul had access to circles that were willing to kill for religious reasons. We can infer this from the story in Acts that later on, Paul himself was almost the victim of an attack by religious zealots. When he was imprisoned by the Romans on his last trip to Jerusalem, a group of zealots planned to assassinate him. However, a nephew living in Jerusalem saved him. He had heard of the murder plot. The nephew must have had contact with these terrorist circles and got wind of their conspiracy. Consolation. I also discovered in my family connection with terrorism. But Paul also discovered such connections. And it saved him. If Paul's family members in Jerusalem had contacts with violent groups, so probably also Paul himself. Whoever is skeptical of his narrative of Acts, also there are many exegetes who say Act is not very valid, yeah? But so we must listen to Paul himself. Paul himself says in the letter to the Romans, before his last trip to Jerusalem, that he is afraid for his life. He knows about opponents who would kill him. I suppose he knew these violent circles only too well, because he had belonged to them temporarily in his youth. Such violent circles are most cruel against apostates. My conclusion is Paul was anything but harmless. He was temporarily a fanatic with terrorist leanings. Our security force in Germany would classify him as Gefährder, dangerous, as a threat of a high degree. Why? He was very intelligent, and intelligent people spread their ideas much more effectively than other people. And above all, he had a gift to win over other people for his concerns. This is shown later by his missionary activity, in which he has many co-workers. Now let's look at the big change in his life. Was this really a turn away from his fanaticism? That's our second question. My second thesis is that Paul actually turned away from his fundamentalism through his conversion. I even suspect that this fundamentalism was already before his conversion a problem for him. Again, we can only indirectly conclude this, and here I disagree with the consensus in New Testament exegesis in the last 50 years. For the last 40 years, Paul's conversion has usually been interpreted as if Paul had lived happily in Judaism, but then the revelation of Christ struck him like a lightning from the blue sky. Only retrospectively did he criticize Judaism. I used to explain this thesis to my students with the following comparison. Paul behaved like an immature young man who had two girlfriends, one after another. The first was the Torah, the Jewish law. The second was the Christian faith, Christ. He was happy with the first. There was no trouble until the second girlfriend entered his life. Only now did he begin to criticize and vilify the first. When I explained it this way, it was very sympathetic. Some young female students said, I know also female young girls who behave in this way. Similarly, Paul criticized his first great love, the Torah, first looking back because he had now found a new love. In fact, Philippians 3, the first text we discussed, speaks for this interpretation. There, Paul emphasizes that he was blameless in Judaism. Paul, who speaks here, was proud of the law. But there are other voices in Paul too. In Romans 7, an I speaks, an ego speaks, who before his redemption through Christ suffered deeply under the law because he could not fulfill it. The contradiction between the two statements is usually solved in such a way that the I, the ego in Romans 7, is considered to be a rhetorical I, with which Paul does not mean himself personally, but wants to express a general statement about all human beings in an emphatic and lively way. I have suggested another solution. Philippians 3 represents, according to my view, the consciousness of the pre-Christian Paul. I fulfill the law without blame. My zeal is credited to me as righteousness, like Pinchas' zeal was credited to him. Consciously, he was a law-abiding Jew who would have denied any internal doubt concerning the law. But that does not exclude that he had an unconscious conflict with the law that became aware to him only after his conversion. Unconsciously, he had long been in doubt as to whether he really fulfilled the law of God by persecuting the harmless group of Christ followers. My picture of the pre-Christian Paul thus looks like this. He had temporarily become a fundamentalist with aggressive activities against Christians as offenders of the law. By persecuting and oppressing the Christians, he was at the same time suppressing doubts within himself. He converted intrapunitive into extrapunitive aggression. In fighting against the Christians, he fought also against an aspect in himself. He persecuted a part of himself in them. So did really the encounter with Christ turn Paul from an enemy of Christians into a missionary of reconciliation? Paul himself sees it that way. In a very fine text in 2 Corinthians 5, he speaks of Christ who for our sake died and was raised. He says about his relationship to Christ, I'm citing, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to flesh," kata, sarka. Even though we can regard Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. We should interpret this in this way. Paul was once a Pharisee, and like the other Pharisees, he criticized Christ and his followers. The tensions between Jesus and the Pharisees are well documented in the Synoptic Gospels. Paul says that at that earlier time, he only knew him according to the flesh, kata sarka. The enigmatic expression, enigmatic for us, to know someone according to the flesh means here, he knew him as an enemy. He once writes to the quarrelsome Corinthians with all their conflicts that they are still fleshly when they quarrel. And in Romans, he defines flesh, sarx, as enmity against God. The fact that Paul knew Christ earlier according to the flesh, therefore, means that he knew him before his conversion as an enemy. And he was no exception. As a Pharisee, that was the usual view of Jesus. Now, Paul continues, he has become a new creature through his conversion. God had given him, by his vocation, the ministry of reconciliation. Through him, God asked his addressees, be reconciled to God. The one who used to be an enemy and persecutor, he became the preacher of reconciliation. And katalage, reconciliation, is always there are two parties, they are enemies, and you must reconcile them. This is so far he was convinced that his zeal for God against his enemies was credited him as righteousness, just as Pinchas was credited his zeal as righteousness, according to Psalm 106. But now he interpreted his righteousness in a totally new way. Now he reads in Genesis 15:6 that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. And that was a faith in what God alone could do. He alone could give Abraham a son and create life. Righteousness here means faith in God who gives life, but not in a God who wants to sacrifice a child. Paul deviates from Jewish and other early Christian statements concerning Abraham with this understanding of the faith of Abraham. All these parallels see the faith of Abraham as the readiness to kill and sacrifice his son Isaac. That was credited as righteousness to Abraham. But Paul must have had a new enlightenment, a new idea. The faith of Abraham was not aimed at the death of Isaac, but at the promise of his birth. Paul realized that God does not want the death, but the life of the child. He believed that. It was credited to him as righteousness, that he believed in his son's life, not in the necessity of his violent killing. Nevertheless, our question is, did Paul really become another person? Reading the letters of Paul, one can doubt whether he really was a great preacher of reconciliation. Wherever he comes, everywhere he provokes quarrels. This leads to our third question. as Paul held on his turn away from fanaticism. One does not strip one's fundamentalism by conversion like an old dress. There's no doubt Paul was in danger to become a Christian fundamentalist, but I want to show that he did continue to work on his change and was motivated to learn tolerance. And to learn tolerance in both regards to deviant persons within his group and also to opponents outside of his group. He resorted in both cases, that's important, to his conversion, to his encounter with Christ. This shows this conversion really was the basis for overcoming his fundamentalism. First, something to the inner tolerance. The example is strong and weak within the community. Paul had to learn tolerance towards other Christians with different opinions. That was a very difficult process for him. In the 40s, Paul, like a Christian fundamentalist, actually risked splitting a Christian congregation in Antioch because of a food taboo. But in the 50s, 10 years later on, both in the letter of the Corinthians and to the Romans, he expressed the opposite opinion. Such taboos are not an issue to split a community and put people of different opinion under pressure to adapt. What had happened in the beginnings of the 40s? The mission of non-Jews or Gentiles was initially controversial in early Christianity. The two main congregations, Antioch and Jerusalem, had different opinions. The Antioch congregation renounced circumcision of males when they became Christians. The Jerusalem congregation insisted on circumcision. At a meeting in Jerusalem, they compromised. Both communities should proceed as before. For Jews, circumcision was to apply. For heathens, one should do without them. Food rules were not discussed in Jerusalem, and this is understandable. The people from Antioch were at this meeting guests in Jerusalem, and the hosts determined what was eaten. They have certainly kept the Jewish food rules. There was no occasion to discuss this problem. In Antioch, the food were a problem because now were the Antioch, the hosts, and they offered also pagan meal. And of course, in the beginning, Peter and Barnabas agreed, friendly persons as they are, but later on there came other persons from Jerusalem and said, we have problems with such a behavior. And so Peter and Barnabas said what is reasonable, and I should also have supported them. We can read, according to Jewish rules. It's no violation of the human rights to eat kosher food, but here Paul is intolerant. He sees this is endangering the Christian liberty, and he probably suffered a defeat in the struggle in Antioch, for he never mentions the Antiochian congregation later on in his letters, and the most exegetes conclude he didn't succeed in convincing the other one. As at that time, Paul was not ready to renounce his freedom from the food rules, and he risked a split in a community, his home community. In Corinth, a similar problem reoccurred in the community he had himself founded in the 50s. But this was even more serious. Some Christians refused to eat meat that was slaughtered in a pagan ritual because it was contaminated with idolatry. That's even worse, They are called the weak ones. Again, Paul is basically for the freedom from all such taboos. But now, he defines this freedom as a duty, if necessary, to renounce on one's own freedom out of love for other people and out of respect for the conscience of other people. Had he already adopted this attitude during the Antiochian conflict, he would have solved this conflict. So here's a real advancement of Paul. For us, the following observation is important. In order to justify his new position, Paul draws on his Easter experience that is on his conversion. Paul concludes the treatment of the problem in 1 Corinthians 8 with the following words, citing, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." And immediately after this statement, he speaks of his conversion, his Easter vision. I'm citing, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? Do we not have the right to eat and drink?" After this statement, he is demonstratively renouncing his right. With him as model, the strong should also renounce their right to eat idle meat. Here we notice a clear development beyond his attitude in the Antiochian conflict. Freedom from the law has become a freedom for the sake of love to renounce the own freedom. I should add, he uses the term synthesis, conscience, in his argumentation, and here invents a new dimension in conscience. It's an interactive conscience. That is a conscience that says you must always take regard to what other conscience will say, also. And if you compare it with the conscience in Philo and Seneca, both authors who use very often conscience, it's a new invention. You never find it in Philo and Seneca, this regard of the other person. And I think this Poland solution is a wonderful example of tolerance. And he's aware of this. There's no problem where he uses so much lines and words, to discuss it. 2 chapters in 1 Corinthians and in Romans. This should not be relativized by the fact that this was only unimportant foot rules, no central theological questions. That's typical for Protestant theologians. Foot rules, what is this, Catholics have more understanding for this. Just such little questions split communities, even today. The pastor may think about God theistically, pantheistically, or panentheistically, or else heretically. Some are even atheists, But he has a real problem if he changes something with the altar in his church, or refuses to baptize small children, or introduces equal marriage ceremonies for homosexuals. Such changes in the visible religion often divide communities much more than difference in the invisible inner convictions. The headscarf splits people today in spite of the fact that what is really important is only what someone thinks under the headscarf. What is with tolerance to people outside the community? There is a consensus in the exegesis that Paul also here changed his view with regard to Jews. In his oldest statement about Israel in 1 Thessalonians 2, there we find a root condemnation. God's wrath, God's storm, has come upon them at last. And this statement is revised in Romans 11 by the certainty of the salvation of all Israel, all Jews. And Paul stresses, even those who are hostile to Paul are and will always be God's beloved. All arrive at salvation. How does Paul imagine that? Paul thinks Christ coming from heaven once more will appear to all Jews in the temple and win them over. Paul imagines this conversation of all Israel according, I think, to the model of his own conversion. That's an idea of Otfried Hofius in Tübingen. He had once been on the way to Damascus as an enemy of Christians. Then Christ appeared in a vision revealed to him from heaven. Paul hopes that in the same way, all Israel will be one at the end of the time, despite its enmity against the followers of Christ. As you can see, Paul has not given up his intolerant fanaticism right away at once. In his work as a missionary and founder of congregations, he had laboriously learned to be more tolerant, to reconcile groups and not to split. I see his greatness in the fact that he was ready to learn from his opponents. First, he fought against the Christians, then he took over their convictions. At first, he refused to restrict his freedom to eat all the food, then he took over the conciliatory attitude of those he had fought before. But can one also say that about his polemics against his opponents, who fought against his mission of the Gentiles? Did he also learn from them? That leads to our last question. Was Paul's polemic against opponents a relapse into his fanaticism? You know, Paul was often brutal against his opponents. In his letters we find curses and polemics that contradict his own exhortation in the letter to the Romans, bless those who persecute, bless and curse not. Twice he emphasized in Galatians, if anyone preaches another gospel, be damned, and so on. I can cite many examples of such polemics. Once he also activates a prejudice prevalent among non-Jews at that time. Jews were said not to be liked by God and were enemies of all people. As it's the only case, said to me a colleague, where an anti-Jewish prejudice was uttered by a Jew himself. Also, it must be said, Paul was also a vicious, filthy maker, eine Dreckschleuder. Yeah? Comparable to Luther also. Yeah? Our great persons have simul justus et peccator, both sides. Must we now revise our judgment on Paul? And we could also, of course, say nobody is perfect. And I don't want to defend Paul's inhumane polemic, but to judge fairly, we should think of three things, three considerations. First, Paul was once someone who has fanatically persecuted others to enforce the norms of the law of Judaism among them. The big turning point in his life was that he got freed from that. He founded communities that were free of the Jewish law. In his missionary activity, he was now confronted with an intra-Christian counter-mission that did exactly what he had done in his pre-Christian times. His opponents put pressure on his churches to impose Jewish norms on them, circumcision and foot laws, two identity markers of Judaism. He fought in these adversaries against himself. That is, against his own past. You know, if you struggle against the mistakes you have made in your children, you are sometimes not very fair. Yeah? My father was a teacher of mathematics, and when I was not so good in mathematics, he couldn't help me. It was horrible, to ask him. His opponents did exactly what he had recognized as the wrong way. I suspect that only these opponents forced him to deal publicly with his past prior to his conversion. The two short flashbacks to his conversion are the two letters dealing with these adversaries in Galatians and Philippians. Here he introduces himself as a model. He has turned away from a zeal that imposed Jewish rules on others. Therefore, his opponents should not impose such rules on his communities. Those who want to make such rules binding should be rejected. Those who fight their own mistakes within others often become unfair and cannot fairly perceive their opponents. That's my explanation. Second, Paul has learned also from these enemies. Their agenda was to lead the Gentile Christian communities back into Judaism. That is, to avoid the division of Judaism. After his conflict with them in the letter to the Galatians and the Philippians, Paul develops in Romans a new vision. I presuppose that Philippians is before Romans, the new vision is only he does not, a new vision with the same goal to unite Christians and Jews, the Christ followers and Jews. Only he does not want to adapt his congregation Judaism, but to liberalize Judaism so that his communities find a place within. That's how I understand the letter to the Romans. Here he develops the hope that Jesus will appear again from heaven and win all the Jews so that all Israel will be saved. Then the phrase that all the Gentiles will go in means simply all are allowed to enter the temple, what was previously forbidden to them. All people will worship God together in the temple. The split will be overcome. Again, I think Paul has learned from his opponents and taken up their target, even he wants to realize it in another way. Third, a last consideration in order to understand why he speaks so polemically and intolerantly in Galatians, Philippians, and 2 Corinthians. Paul is convinced that he must be intolerant of intolerance. And this is a common dilemma. All are confronted with this. The more clearly we promote tolerance, the more we need to be intolerant to intolerance. It is clear that we can be unfair when we try to do this. But the contradictions in which we see Paul are contradictions, but that nobody escapes. There's no point concealing it by illusions. Finally, back to our fundamental questions. How dangerous is religion? Does it seduce people into fanaticism and intolerance? The example of Paul shows that even religious people who have lost themselves in intolerance and fanaticism can turn back. Even people who were persecutors can become reconcilers. Jesus is the foundation of Christianity. Paul is his architect. It's a stroke of luck that we find someone in the foundations of Christianity who can be a model of how to turn from intolerance to tolerance, from fanaticism to reconciliation, from zelos to katalage. He owes this conversion to his encounter with Christ. It is founded at the heart of his Christian faith. Paul's model commits us to the belief that we should never give up the hope that young people, also old people who have temporarily radicalized, can turn away from their fanaticism. In that sense, I associate the life of Paul with a hope. Religious fanatics can convert, and with the same energy with which they previously have created mischief and sufferings, they stand up for reconciliation and tolerance. I do not discuss now the question that nowadays many criticize the Christian religion not for fanaticism, but for the contrary of fanaticism, that it produces too many Guders and Gutmenschen who are willing open to the borders to fugitives and within our society wish to help all losers, all the homeless people. But I point out, nearly every criticism of religion has an antithesis within the criticism of religion. That's one of my pet ideas. On the one side, we find the reproach of fanaticism against religion. On the other side, the accusation of an exaggerated human hypermorality. Of course, you may say hypermorality is also some kind of fanaticism, but it is surely another kind of fanaticism, quite another category. Reality will not capitulate in the face of our morality, but neither should our morality capitulate before reality. And this is the danger today. I think that there are both some extreme forms of fanaticism and also of hypermorality we have to avoid. Both extremes support at all events my thesis: religion can be dangerous. You need your reason, your brains. Paul shows that religion is indeed dangerous. With Hölderlin one can say, but where there's danger also grows what rescues. I had also likewise, where the rescuing grows, so does the danger. And I see in it a rule that imprints the whole reality. With life, something fascinating and new emerged in this reality. A development to higher forms began. But with life, also death came into the world. With the good grew also the danger. Later, something new emerged with human culture. Culture makes life possible where it would not have has a chance under natural conditions. It makes it possible through technology and tools, through the law that protects us one another, especially through a morality committing to helping the weak and lost and the sick person. But the culture not only brought tools to help each other, but also weapons to kill each other. Today we can destroy our entire culture. The danger grew with everything that rescues. In the midst of our human culture emerged salvation religions, Erlösungsreligion. They have taught us that culture and morality are not true life, but that true life is to be found beyond morality. That's a central thesis also of Reformation. Belief, not works. True life begins in Christianity through contact with a God who is pure grace. In Buddhism, through meditative absorption into a nothingness that is free of all conflicts. But with the religions of salvation, also fanatics came into the world who thought that beyond morality, they had to lead the world to salvation through terror. Where the rescue grows, danger also grows. In our case, it means that where life, culture, and religion arise, death, war, and fanaticism also grows. In the Bible, I think we find a counter-tendency, in spite of the fact that many say this is also a document of fanaticism, but in the center of the Old Testament is the belief in a one and only God. And I defend this belief. He is often accused in the present that he seduces to fanaticism. But besides the demand of love for this God stands the command to love one's neighbor, a commandment which forbids any fanaticism. And Jesus, or the tradition before Jesus, has combined both commandments from the Old Testament as equal commandments. He who hates his neighbor and terrorizes him should not speak of loving God. And Jesus has added also few minimal words, what is far too little known. In the Old Testament, we read the demand to love God with all human faculties, with all our heart, with all our souls, and with all our power. 3. Jesus added we should also love God with our reason. Luther's translation of Dianoia, in German with Gemüt, does not apply to what is meant by reason, Dianoia. The ecumenical translation of Catholics and Protestants says correctly that we should love God with all our thoughts, Dianoia, and that we should love him with the whole understanding, Synesis. Reason tells us faith in the one and only God who does not consider the love for neighbor to be as important as faith in God quickly becomes fanaticism. But love tells us reason without faith in God quickly becomes cynicism, intoxicated by the futility of the world and without the power and motivation to fight that futility. I conclude with my personal theological principle: faith without reason tends to fanaticism, reason without faith to cynicism. Many thanks for listening.